All right, so welcome to our November 2022 training for the Lunch and Learn. I'm so excited to be joined by Liz Fillingame. Some of you might know Liz because she's a deputy child advocate. And our topic today is Social Security, specific for youth experiencing foster care. So Liz, I'll turn it right over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself and take over?
Yep. So thanks, Lauren. Like she said, my name is Liz Fillingame. I'm a deputy child advocate based out of the Wilmington office, but I do take cases statewide. And so I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about Social Security, specifically as it relates to our youth experiencing foster care. I want to be very upfront that I am by no means a Social Security attorney, and this is not a typical practice area for me. But the reason that I'm the one giving this presentation is because I sort of manage not the money itself. Our office doesn't have anything to do with the funds, but I sort of manage the information about the money for all the kids that receive Social Security that are in foster care in Delaware. So with that said, let's jump right in. All right, so there are two types of Social Security that youth may qualify for. We refer to these generally as SSI, or Supplemental Security Income, and survivor benefits. So most frequently, our youth get SSI. And these are monthly payments to adults and children with a disability who have income and resources that are below specific limits. So for the purposes of this training, we're not going to get into kind of down in the weeds about what those income and resource limits are. For the most part, it's not an issue for our kids, but those are things that exist and we kind of keep track of. So most of our youth get Social Security via SSI. Some of them also get survivor benefits. And so if a youth is younger than 18 or 19, if they're a full-time student still in high school, not in college, or they're older than 18 but had a disability prior to becoming 22, then they may qualify for survivor benefits. You may also hear these referred to as death benefits. So what this means is if someone passes away, typically a parent in our case, that a youth may be eligible to receive a portion of that parent or guardian's Social Security funds. So survivor benefits are benefits, like I said, that belong to someone other than our youth, such as a parent, but are now eligible to be transferred to your client. Typically happens because of death. The youth is eligible for 75% of whatever that payment was. So if they were getting $1,000 a month, the youth would be eligible for up to $750 a month. All right, SSI is a little more tricky. So this is something that the youth has to qualify for on their own, right? So it's not just something that they're inheriting, they have to qualify for it. So to qualify, they have to have a diagnosis and two marked areas of impairment or one extreme limitation in functioning. So that's really kind of, we don't expect you guys obviously to be able to say, yes, this client or this youth has such and such diagnosis, or I think they have two areas of marked impairment, right? What does that even mean? What we want you to be able to do is say, oh, I heard my client's doctor or my youth's counselor talking about a diagnosis, and I've been hearing from the teacher or the foster parent that there's some concerns with how they're able to function. At that point, if you know your youth is not already receiving Social Security, we have a general screening tool that we can send you to answer some basic questions. And then we can figure out, do we need to move forward with this? Is this something that we should be applying for this particular youth? So you don't have to be an expert by any means. That's not what we're going to accomplish today. You just kind of have to know the basics and when maybe you should be helping to get the ball rolling. And then I'm here to help you do that. So I want to show you what this eligibility checklist looks like. Let me minimize that. All right, so this is the checklist, and I will provide it to Lauren so that she can send it around after the training. So we have to have a diagnosis and then 2 marked areas of impairment, whether it be school, home, or one extreme limitation. So some of these questions are the ones that we have found most helpful in determining, do we need to take that next step? Is it worth getting a formal evaluation and diagnosis? Because someone's going to have to pay for that, right? Whether it's Medicaid or someone else. And so this kind of helps us figure out, is it worth pursuing? Is the youth in an institutional setting, like a residential treatment facility? If so, they may have a diagnosis that's going to qualify them. Has the youth been hospitalized for mental health or physical health more than 3 times in the past year, right? Has the youth been suspended or expelled for behavior issues in the past 2 years? Does the youth have an IEP? Does the youth have seizures, right? And so I won't read you all the questions, but this kind of helps you if you think your youth may be eligible for Social Security, but you're not sure. If you use this checklist and answer yes to more than a couple of the questions, probably a pretty good indication that we should be doing something about it. All right. So DFS screens every youth for eligibility automatically, or at least they're supposed to. And if they're eligible, then DFS will submit an application on the child's behalf for Social Security. And the reason DFS does this is because, frankly, they have incentive to, right? It is DFS that manages the money as it comes in. And so they have an incentive to apply for this on behalf of the child. But it's important for us as advocates for the child to understand when a youth may qualify. Mistakes can happen, kids can get overlooked, and so we want to make sure that they're not missing out on a benefit that they are entitled to. All right, so I mentioned that OCA tracks youth in care that receive Social Security funds. So every month I get a report from DFS that tells me every youth that received funds for that month. The reason we started this project a few years ago was because we started realizing that balances on these funds were exceeding $2,000. That's a problem because if the funds exceed $2,000, then the funds are at risk for being sent back to Social Security because a recipient cannot have more than $2,000 in cash assets sitting in an account, whether it's an account they control or an account that DFS controls for them. So DFS has to kind of maintain a ledger of who has how much money. And when it gets to be above 2,000, then it becomes a concern. So when we started this project, we had tons and tons of kids every month that had balances well over $2,000. Now it doesn't happen as often. I probably send a couple emails a month regarding kids who have balances over $2,000. And when that does happen, if your youth already receives funds and you get an email from me, it'll say something like, hey, so-and-so receives Social Security funds. Their balance is X amount of dollars. This is a concern because we don't want them to lose the money. Please find a way to spend it. DFS is usually pretty good at spending the money. They spend it on room and board primarily, right? So those payments that foster parents get for taking care of a youth. If that youth receives Social Security, that is what pays for it, or at least pays for it in part. So how do we get balances then if DFS is using this money for room and board? A couple ways. If a youth is in a placement that is paid for by some other agency, like an RTC and Medicaid is paying, or a treatment facility and PBH is paying, right? The prevention and behavioral health is paying. Then DFS isn't paying. And so these monies can build up. And the longer they are at that placement, the higher the balance can get. Another way youth can end up with lump sums is at the very beginning. Social Security is awarded from the time a person applies. But by the time a decision is made, it has generally been months, many months, before we get a determination. And so that first payment will be a lump sum payment. And if your youth was receiving, let's say $750 a month, and it took 6 months to get that application granted, then you're looking at about $5,000 that they're going to get all at one time. So you will get an email from me prompting you, and it'll go to the CASA, the coordinator, and the child attorney, prompting the team that that money needs to be spent down. All right, we just kind of went through that. So what can we spend these funds on? Well, we have another little checklist that goes out with my email that I'll show you in just a second. So if you get this email asking you to spend down these funds, then you're going to get this checklist that says, hey, these are the things we can spend it on. These are the things we cannot spend it on, right? So what kind of things can we spend it on? We can pay rent with this money, but only for that calendar month. And that's very important. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We can pay security deposits. We can buy clothes. We can purchase things for hobbies, arts and crafts supplies, musical instruments. They can use it for entertainment. If they want to go to the movies, they can go to the movies with this money, right? There's tons of things that we can use it for, but what can't we spend these funds on? We cannot prepay rent or other bills. So we can't pay 6 months of rent in advance. We can't pay 6 months of an electric bill in advance. We can't save it in any form. We can't use it to buy savings bonds. We can't open investment accounts with it. We can't put it in a savings account and let it build up so that we can use it on a down payment on a car, right? Because we're trying to avoid going over that $2,000 threshold. So it's not that you can't save it at all. You could save it a little bit, but you can't exceed that $2,000 limit. And then they're also not allowed to use the funds to purchase gifts or to give the money away. So, let's go back and look at that checklist. All right, so this is what the checklist looks like that comes with the email that's asking you to spend down funds. So again, it kind of reiterates the $2,000 cap. So we can use it to pay rent, mortgage, if they've bought a house. Most of our youth aren't in that situation. Household furnishings, appliances, modifications or home repairs, maintenance, anything that's needed to accommodate a disability, household expenses, food, utilities. If you have a youth that is in a residential treatment facility, their funds will build up. They are allowed $30 a month for personal needs, whether that's hygiene products or whatever it may be. There is a little bit of money that we can access for whatever they need while they're there. Medical expenses you can pay for, books, computers, things that are needed for school. You can even use it for vacation, right? This is a big one because if we have, sometimes we tap into this money for youth that have family out of state that we're trying to plan with. This is an option for helping to facilitate things like plane tickets. Attorney's fees, if there's a youth that has really significant needs and they need some help with planning, like long-term care planning, we can use money we can use their Social Security funds to help them figure out their long-term care plans. All right. You can use the money to buy a car, but again, you can't build it up so long that you're using it for a down payment that exceeds $2,000, but you could pay a monthly car payment out of these funds. All right, and then there's a procedure here. This is primarily for the child attorney because that's whose responsibility it will be to facilitate obtaining the funds, but it's here if you have any interest in reading through it. There's a form. Typically what will happen is we will buy the things ourselves if it's feasible, and then we will get reimbursed, and that's our kind of reimbursement form. That's really Social Security in a nutshell as it relates to our kids in care. What questions do you guys have? I'm going to stop sharing.
Perfect. I have a couple questions, giving people maybe a chance to kind of think about their questions. But you said something about receiving 75% of the funds. Can you tell me, like, can you tell me why, and which funds were those ones?
So that's survivor benefits, specifically when a youth is getting the benefits that were going to a parent who has passed away. And that's just what Social Security has set as the guideline. 75% is what they're eligible to receive. If there's more than one youth, then they would split that 75%. So let's say there were two kids, siblings in foster care, and their dad was receiving Social Security. They would split that 75%. It wouldn't be 75% each.
Okay. And then my other question was all right, so DFS receives I think this is for disability, for supplemental, not survivor,
Yes,
the supplemental
SSI.
SSI. Yeah. If DFS is using it for reimbursement to foster parents, how does that affect the other funds that DFS receives that would normally pay for the foster placement if SSI were not available?
So the way this has been explained to us at OCA is part of DFS's annual budget, or DSCYF's annual budget, takes into account an estimation of Social Security funds that they're going to receive. For better or worse, there is one state, Maryland, that has recently in the last few years passed a law that says kids' Social Security funds cannot be used to pay for their placement. The problem potentially with that is, what are you using it for so that the balance does not exceed the $2,000 that we're allowed to hold? Are you just buying them clothes every month because we have to spend the money down? Then the question becomes, is it a need or is it not a need? And there's not good data yet from Maryland to say how they're dealing with that issue.
Yeah, like if that's a good idea or not. Okay.
Right, whether or not that's a good idea. Because I mean, on the surface, it sounds like a great idea, right? Yeah, let's hold this money for kids. Why are we making kids pay for essentially their room and board when a youth not in foster care wouldn't be expected to pay for that themselves, right? But on the other hand, as long as that $2,000 limit remains there, are we using it for practical purposes?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know kind of what else is the money able, how else do they actually spend the money?
Right. Yeah.
So DFS kind of into account already.
Yes.
Got it.
So without that, let's say Delaware passed a similar law that said, okay, you're not allowed to use this money anymore for their room and board. Like, you have to find other things to spend it on. DSCYF would not be in support of that because it would have a significant impact on their budget.
Sure. Sorry, Peggy, do you have a question?
I have a situation. And when I saw the topic of this, I thought, this is perfect. Get my alarm to go on. I have a youth. I just got his case in early summer. He's going to be 18 December 30th. He's just wanting to get out of the system. I've had no luck connecting with him, neither has his independent living worker or whatever. But in an email I got back in August from the youth attorney, Melissa Hutchinson, she indicated that this young man had a balance of $8,647 in Social Security funds. And she wanted me to talk with DFS worker about how they could spend it down. And this is the first time I've had any involvement with a youth that had this situation. So it was, foreign to me. But I did talk with a worker. We talked about, like I said, he's just not really been very cooperative. I think he's just waiting till he turns 18. But I was confused because the DFS worker was saying, I don't think he can have it all, or we got to spend it down. And I suggested, well, maybe we should get him driver's ed classes and get him some kind of vehicle or something, because he's going to need that, when he turns 18, especially if he's just going to throw his hands up at all of us and say, I'm done. But at the last hearing last week, and we were talking with Judge Very, it just seemed like it was kind of new to this particular worker too, how it all works and what it is. And his mother, from what I understand, it is death benefits from a mother. It's I think his balance is now down to 5,000 something, but I'm just curious if you manage all the foster, privately, like to ask you to, maybe look at this particular child's case and see if you can answer some of my questions or
Yeah, we can
whatever.
do that.
Because we're going to have an exit meeting soon. I doubt that there's going to be another scheduled hearing, but I just want to make sure I understand it and can, at least if he'll listen to me, he doesn't talk much, advise him or, help him understand what this is all about.
Yeah, so I can comment on a couple things, and we can certainly connect offline and talk specifically about that. One is I only get a monthly report. So it usually comes around about the 10th of the month. I usually get my emails out by the 20th. And then by the time it gets to you guys and you're communicating to a DFS worker and they're getting back to you, sometimes the response I get is, you told me there was money there and there's no money there. Sometimes DFS gets ahead of us and spends it before we can go through our process of getting it spent down. So that does happen occasionally. And unfortunately, it's just an imperfect system in that sense. There is a difference, and I didn't include this in the presentation because it gets really confusing really fast. There is some Social Security funds apply that $2,000 threshold, and some do not. Death benefits specifically do not. So he could accumulate funds in that particular case. The reason we try not, as a general rule, just to not do that is because unless we are 100% sure that he does receive death benefits and not SSI benefits, and that $2,000 limit doesn't apply, then he's at risk for losing the funds, right? And we're getting all of this information secondhand from DFS. So there's no way for me to verify independently with the Social Security Administration that his benefits are actually death benefits and not SSI. So it's okay for him to accumulate a balance and not others. So if we can get that confirmation in writing from DFS, and sometimes we can and sometimes we can't, sometimes they're not sure. And I can't say a whole lot about their policies for how they kind of manage this and how they get their information. Then I would be comfortable saying, sure, hold on to that and he can purchase a car with it or whatever it is. But if we can't get that confirmation, then you don't want to hold on to it because we don't want to risk it being sent back.
Well, from my discussions, I'm pretty sure it's death benefits.
Okay.
But then there was also in the conversation something about, well, once he turns 18, they don't just hand him over it's down to 5,000 some dollars as of last week, I think.
So that's incorrect. Unless he has.
That's what I'm trying to understand. What is the policy? So
when he turns 18, DFS is supposed to fill out a form so that he becomes the payee. Now, there are, of course, exceptions to that, right? If we have a youth who is not functioning to the point that they could be responsible for their own money and someone else is going to do that for them, then that person could become the payee. But otherwise, DFS should be filling out a form right around his 18th birthday that makes him the payee. Now, if that youth is going to be part of independent living services, then that money he gets would factor into what kind of assist budget he gets. For those of you that are familiar with assist. So I think an assist stipend, I think the maximum is $1,100 a month, somewhere around there. If a youth is receiving Social Security benefits, then that's going to be factored into their budget when their independent living worker figures out how much money they need to make their bills every month. And so your youth, let's say he was getting $800 a month for death benefits. He may only need $200 a month in assist funds to meet his needs. So he may not get that full $1,100. On the other hand, a youth who is not receiving any kind of Social Security benefits may need the full $1,100, right? So it plays into it in that sense. And maybe that's what DFS meant by, we don't just like hand it to him. He's not eligible for both funding, I guess, in its entirety.
Well, he has not, up until very recently, started to engage a little bit with his independent living worker. He passed his GED a few weeks ago, and now he's, I don't know if it's just momentary, but he seems like he might, he's not eligible for a board extension, but he might work with his independent living worker, moving forward. I'm trying to encourage him to, but, it's just been very recent, and I don't know if tomorrow he's going to just say, no, I don't want any parts of anything. But if he just ages out at 18 and he doesn't work, doesn't want any services, what happens to that money? I mean, because we're going to give it to him and he's just going to blow it.
He can do whatever he wants with it, frankly.
I
mean, we should, and legally we have to give it to him once he's a legal adult. We don't have a choice. I mean, he should be counseled, right, by DFS and us, right, as his legal team. These are the things you're allowed to use it for. These are the things you're not allowed to use it for. There should also be some, well, I guess for him it's death benefits, so there's no need to talk about whether or not he should be applying for adult benefits because it's not his own disability. But if you have a youth who has a disability, there should at least be a discussion about, do we think this person is going to qualify for adult benefits? And if so, we need to figure out how to help them with that process.
Yeah, good question. Okay. Peggy, I think maybe if you have specific questions, it might help for you and Liz to kind of chat, and then she can look into his case kind of specifically if you have questions. Yeah. That
would be good if we could do that.
Sure. We do have a question in the chat. So if a child is receiving survivor benefits because their father is deceased and leaves the parental home and is placed elsewhere, so I'm assuming placed in DFS custody somewhere, whose responsibility is it to see that her SSI follows her and does not continue to stay with biological mom or biological remaining parent?
So it would be DFS who would file, right, as the payee, but sometimes DFS doesn't always know right away. Sometimes we have information before them. So we could alert DFS by saying, hey, this youth received Social Security, has DFS filed to become the payee. And that process does take a couple months. It's not instantaneous, as all things are with the federal government. So it takes a little time, but we can at least let them know, hey, you should file. It's not something that we would file for, again, because we don't manage those funds. We don't want to manage those funds. It's not something that we could file to become payee on.
What are, just kind of a follow-up to that, what are ways that DFS finds out that there is SSI, related to a child in one way or another?
They probably, and I don't know this for sure, but my guess is when they get a youth that comes in, it's part of just their automatic screening process to submit to Social Security Administration and see if that youth receives benefits.
Gotcha. Robin, do you have a follow-up question?
I do. Could you see the light bubble on top of my head, Lauren?
Absolutely.
So if BioMom then is receiving the payments till it gets switched with the federal government and goes to DFS, is she obligated to pay that back then?
I mean, technically, yes, but practically speaking, no one's going to enforce it because the process of enforcing it would be more expensive than not.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I know we've had that situation quite a few times when SSI does switch from a bio parent to DFS, the parent still receives it for quite a little bit of time. And there's really no way to
There's no way to do it. And I mean, at the end of the day, you were probably talking at most a few $1,000s. Chances are it's already gone, right? They're not holding it and saving it. It's gone. And so, yeah, as a practical matter, it just doesn't happen.
Thank you.
What other questions do we have? Ginny, go ahead. If you want to unmute yourself.
There we go. As a CASA, how aware are we supposed to be with where their funds are coming from? If they're SSI or if they're getting just regular?
Yeah, I don't want you guys to try to get bogged down in that because, like I said, I'm getting the information secondhand. I'm passing it on to you. So by the time it's getting to you guys, it's third hand. We don't have a good grasp on whether or not it is SSI or SSA or survivor. Like we don't have a good grasp. We can't independently verify. So we just kind of treat it like it shouldn't get above $2,000 across the board. And then if there are really specific instances where you just feel like, gosh, this kid really needs a car, is responsible enough for a car, then I think it's worth a separate email to me where I can reach out to DFS and say, okay, can we definitively verify that these are funds that are not subject to that $2,000 limit? But in most cases, while it would be nice for our kids to have cars, the reality is they're not responsible enough, or they don't have car insurance, or they don't have the ability to get car insurance, or they haven't been employed long enough, right? There's a lot of other barriers. So it doesn't usually make sense to save for something like that, although for some youth it can make sense.
But I don't even have any, I have no awareness of how much money comes into this child, whether it's SSI or however, or any child that I've had in the past. That's not ever been something I've discussed with the foster family or the child or anything. And that doesn't even seem to be something that a foster family seems to be forthcoming with.
They probably wouldn't even know, honestly. A foster family wouldn't know because they're going to get their board payment from DFS regardless, whether it's funded by supplemental, by Social Security, or just by a DFS payment. They would have no idea because DFS gets the money and then just sends them the check they would send anyway. And 9 times out of 10, the youth probably wouldn't know, right? Unless they're a lot older and very tuned in, or they want something. Sometimes they find out they have money laying around because they want something and they think that we can just tap into it. You probably won't know that your youth has funds unless that balance exceeds that $2,000. That's really the only triggering point for an email in our office, because right now I looked at the list that I got for October, and there were roughly 100 kids in foster care in Delaware that were receiving funds. Of those, only 3 had a balance over $2,000. So those are the only emails I would send out. The rest of them, for the most part, get their funds come in and they go right back out because their funds are less than whatever is being paid for their board payment to a foster family or a placement. So for the most part, this is not an issue across the board that you would really have to deal with. Kind of the 2 things to have your radar up for is, 1, you have a kid who you don't think has receives any kind of Social Security payments, right? And you could just ask the DFS worker, they should know. Hey, does Bobby receive Social Security, disability, or SSI? No, why? Then you could kind of get the ball rolling on, well, I think they have a disability and those 2 categories. So let me see if I can kind of get this process started by talking to my coordinator and the attorney, right? And then the other thing is, if you get that email, to spend it down. Those are kind of the 2 areas that we could really use your help on.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
That's helpful. That's a really helpful question. Yeah. Like what's our role? And I hear it while you saying, like, think about ways to spend down the money. So yeah, like let's think about what your youth needs and what they might benefit from. Yeah. And, appropriately be able to utilize, like some would absolutely benefit from a car or car insurance or driver's ed, while others might not. So that's kind of maybe the more fun conversation to have with your triad team.
It is. Oh, that's always a fun conversation.
What other questions do we have? All right, that might be it.
Awesome.